Guys have a huge crowd here, so I'm kind of shocked. And whenever they said that this was your all's first meeting back in some time, I thought, oh boy, who have you got to speak for this one? But anyway, thank you guys for having me out today. My name is Jacob Smith, and like Tyler said, I am from Dayton, Tennessee, home of the Scopes trial. I saw the courthouse up when I walked in, and the story that I'm pleased to share with you all today is a very interesting one to me. Little bit of a disclaimer here. I've known about Mary Shadow a lot longer than I've known about David Hill, and so you'll probably be able to tell that based on how I talk about them both. But for those of you that don't know, I have a connection to Mary Shadow, not genealogically, but as you'll see in the presentation, one of my relatives actually ran against her for state representative, and so that was sort of the end of his political career and the beginning of hers, and that's where I got interested in her. As for Dr. David Hill, I actually didn't know who really he was until about last fall, I guess it was. And Dr. Hill, I always just referred to him as Mary Shadow's husband. I didn't really know much about him until I got into working on my senior thesis, which I have a copy up here of. And I really wrote a lot of it about Mary Shadow. He got mentioned in just a little bit. And so whenever Tyler asked me to give this presentation today, I said, well, I'm going to have to do some research on Dr. Hill, so by no means am I an expert on him, but I do know quite a bit about her, which does help a little bit because she's actually more connected to the area than he is. And so I'm going to kind of hover back and forth today, switching slides, so be patient with me, please, and we're going to get started. There we go. So I wanted to lay this out kind of chronologically, or at least as chronological as possible, and I'm going to scoot your flag over here so I can a little bit. But anyway, the only thing that's really not chronological about the presentation is actually the few opening slides that I've got here, because like I said, I know more about Mary than I do about David, and Mary's connection to the area is a lot heavier than David's is. So he's actually older than she is, but we're going to talk about her first. And as another disclaimer, because I don't know how these slides are going to look, I made this on Microsoft PowerPoint. I just had to transition it to Google Slides before I got here. So if it looks wonky or weird, I apologize in advance, but you should be able to read most of it. We're going to go from their time of their birth and when they grew up, really to about 1960s-ish. I wouldn't go into detail on all their lives, but we would be here for quite a while, and I think that you all will probably get hungry and tired of listening to me. So that's more for your benefit than it is for mine, because they are very interesting people, and as you've heard already, we have quite a bit of a connection to not only the Manhattan Project, but to a little bit of Tennessee political history that's very interesting as well. So I do want to start, like I said, with Mary Shadow. So Mary Shadow was born on July the 17th, 1925 in Winchester, Tennessee. She was the daughter of Willis A. Shadow and Mary M. Ermlich, or Ermlich. I've heard people pronounce it both ways. And she was the second oldest of 5 sisters, as you can see. The oldest was Lucy, and then right after Mary was Muriel, in which we already talked a little bit about her. And up until recently, whenever I had wrote my senior thesis, I said that Mary Shadow was a self-made woman. And I still have that belief to an extent, but what I didn't realize until I started researching her folks here was just how immense her past was. Her father was an aviator in World War I, and I'm a big Star Wars guy, and so whenever I heard Han Solo say, going through hyperspace ain't like dust and crops, boy, that's kind of what came to mind, because that's pretty much what they had told Willis Shadow whenever he went to be an aviator in World War I, and that was that it's going to be hard, and you're from a farm in Tennessee. I don't know that you can do it, but he passed every test with flying colors. And actually, his daughter Mary, the one we're talking about today, went on to get her pilot's license. And so I don't know how many members of the Tennessee state legislature can say they had their pilot's license, but she's one of them. Found that pretty interesting. Her mother was Mary, also, that's where her name comes from, and she was a nurse that was affiliated with the Red Cross. She actually went to the Kellogg School up in Battle Creek. And honestly, I didn't realize this, like I said, until I started looking into her lineage, but those two right there were very accomplished. And Mary, I think, was self-made to an extent, but I believe that she owed a lot of support to her parents. Mary Ermlich Shadow was at one time the Tennessee Mother of the Year. I believe that was in the mid to late 50s, and she actually received like a tray as an award, like a sterling silver tray from Eleanor Roosevelt. So she was not a pushover either. In fact, these two are kind of considered the matriarch and the patriarch of the Shadow family, and they have a very storied legacy. You could probably do a presentation just about them, if I'm being honest. So anyway, to connect those two, and you're probably wondering, well, if she's born in Winchester, how does she end up over here close to us? Well, back during, after World War I, Willis Shadow, he returned from the war, and he had a nursery. Not like a baby nursery, but like a tree nursery, you know. And he would travel around and celebrate like agricultural stuff and things like that. And he went to Roane County. Well, as I said, Mary, the mother, she graduated from the Kellogg Nursing School, and she had been assigned to the Roane County Health Department. So we're getting kind of closer right there. The two had met in Roane County, and they married there in 1923. And like I said, Mary was born in 25. And Willis took the mother back to Winchester. Well, after that, as you can see there in that next to last point, the stock market crash of 29 hit everybody hard, not just the Shadows. And so Willis Shadow, his nursery business really didn't recover from that. And as a result, he had loaded his family up and moved them to Decatur. I don't know, at the moment anyway, how that connection was established as far as how he would later become county agricultural agent. I know that he was a very intelligent man himself. He was highly educated. And so it's not really a shock whenever you look back at his history that that's how he ends up, but I don't know who reached out to him to facilitate that position. But he would become county agricultural agent as soon as the family moved over, and that's kind of how they got to Decatur. And so whenever they got to Decatur, Mary Shadow, she was raised in that area. She played basketball for Meigs County High School for Coach House at the time. That's kind of important going forward. But after that, she would attend an all-girls school in Georgia, and then she eventually would transfer up here to Athens, where she went to Tennessee Wesleyan. So she is a Wesleyan graduate. Growing up, though, she was very involved with her Methodist church, and she said that she wanted to become a missionary. She was very mission-minded, wanted to help her community, wanted to help other people. And so you can kind of see from an early age how her interest in politics could come out of her interest in serving her community. And then these are some more pictures here. Believe it or not, this older lady right here is on her father's side of the family. And this is Mary whenever she was younger. This is the older sister Lucy. And this is Muriel. And of course, that's their mother in the back. But they are with their great-grandmother there, on her, like I said, on her father's side. And I want to say that lady was about 94 years old when that picture was made. So you got a couple of generations of the family right there. And then, of course, this is out of the Chattanooga Times. Here's Mary at age 6. That was following a health exam. So little picture of Mary when she was younger. Now on to Dr. David Hill. So David L. Hill was born as David Lawrence Hill on November the 11th, 1919 in Boonville, Mississippi. He was the only child of Professor David Alexander Hill, Jr. and Mabel Claire Brown Hill. His family was very prominent in the Boonville area. He had a lot of connections there, sort of like the Shadows did in Winchester. His grandfather was superintendent of the local school system, and his family had connections to several colleges, one of which being Ole Miss. And as you can see on screen there, the reason that he was an only child was because he lost his father to a tragic drowning accident in 1925. He drowned in Lake Michigan. And that was on I think this is on a summer camp trip with friends. I'd have to go back and look at that though. He and his mother would live with his grandmother. Her name was Ella Spain Brown as he came of age. And one thing that I will say about David, based on what research I have done, is he became quickly known for his intelligence. He had a lot of educational abilities. In fact, he took a nationwide test, get that in there, nationwide test in 1938, consisting of almost 20,000 students from 133 universities across the United States, and he finished in the top 13. He was a pretty smart, and he was only 19 at that time. He was a pretty smart individual, and so it was very interesting to learn a little bit about his history. And honestly, I'm really interested to look more into him going forward, because like I said, this has really all happened, as Tyler mentioned, out of Oppenheimer. I didn't know who he really was until I went and watched the movie. I kind of knew that he had some connections to the Manhattan Project, and we'll see that moving forward. But it was very, very interesting and enlightening to see his connection to history and how he was raised. And so David's path would eventually lead him to the California Institute of Technology, where he would graduate in 1942, and he continually held the highest awarded scholarship for 4 consecutive years while studying at that institution. So if you want to get one thing out there, one little character trait about David Hill, very smart guy. And then this was very interesting. I didn't have this picture until probably about 2 weeks ago. I was going through some Ole Miss yearbooks. That is his father whenever he was a student at Ole Miss. There are a couple pictures of him out there actually, but that was a close-up and that was sort of like a portrait of him, so I was very happy to see that. And then this, of course, is his father's obituary. And his father wasn't very old, of course, like I said, and since David was an only child, he didn't really have that connection for much of his life. So it's very sad to learn of his dad's passing, but it also is what contributed to his character and furthered his career in a sense by making him a little more relentless and passionate and driven for success. He was very much like his father in that regard, because his father was also known to be a highly intelligent man. Now we're going to get into a little bit of substance. So this is kind of what got the program together. Tyler had reached out to me and asked me if I could do something about Dr. Hill. And I said, well, I can tie Dr. Hill into Mary's shadow because, like I said, I've just not studied him as much. But this is where it really got interesting for me. And so we talk about the Manhattan Project, and you're wondering, well, what exactly did he do? Because that's a big thing to be part of the Manhattan Project. And after college, after he left Pasadena, after college, he found his way to Chicago, to the University of Chicago, and he began helping as a research assistant before eventually becoming an associate physicist and a group leader. He worked under a famed Italian scientist, you probably heard of him, named Enrico Fermi, on a little experiment known as Chicago Pile 1. They call it CP1. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, that little thing up there in the top left corner, all of that, and I wrote this down because I thought it was pretty interesting. CP1 is comprised of 770,000 pounds of graphite. So that's what you see stacked up over there. And what CP1 was basically known for was it was the world's first successful nuclear chain reactor. That was a pretty incredible feat done at that time. And so to connect this in your head here, you see the map down here of where all the little locations are, the Manhattan Project. Of course, you can see Oak Ridge, we're sort of familiar with that one. And then Los Alamos, Chicago's on there. This was pretty important in that regard because in like the 30s especially, the Nazis were saying that they had split the atom. And that's essentially what they were doing at CP1 was splitting the atom. So we were trying to see if we could call their bluff. And when we did what they had said that they'd done and we were successful with it, it sort of helped us realize the capabilities that nuclear technology had, but it also warned us of the impending dangers that the Nazis might be able to have if they have a bomb. So that kind of started the whole race for the atomic bomb, and David Hill was very much a part of that. And after the successful test, or after the successful construction and test of the bomb, which of course was done at the Trinity test, Hill was one of 70 scientists to sign the Salazar petition, which asked President Truman to warn the Japanese of our atomic capabilities. And that was in the event that they failed to surrender. Of course, the Japanese were one of those types that they would fight to the bloody end. That's kind of how they were, that was their culture, you know, the whole kamikaze, you've heard of that before. And so the letter, which you see over here, it never made it to President Truman's desk, and it wasn't declassified until 1961. And Dr. Hill was one of the signers of that. And there we go. I don't know if we'll be able to watch it or not, but I have a video right here. If you want to see it later, I can pull it up on YouTube. But we have footage of the Trinity test, and so this was the atomic bomb as we saw in Oppenheimer. This is the real one from 1945, and it's kind of chilling to watch whenever you see it because it seems really so like small and sudden, and then there it comes. You know what I mean? So it's very, very, I don't know, raises the hair on your back, so to speak. Now, let's tie that into us. You're probably wondering, okay, well, here's this guy, he's from Mississippi. Apparently he marries Mary Shadow at some point. Well, how does her path start? Like I said, she ended up coming to Wesleyan for college, and she graduated from Wesleyan in 45, 46, somewhere in there, right after World War II ended. And of course, what happened after World War II? All the soldiers that survived, they came home. This is where your all story ties in, right? I'm sure everyone in this room, I hope, and everybody in this room has heard of the Battle of Athens. Well, Mary Shadow had heard of it too, because as she was working through her studies and stuff, she went to graduate school. She was eventually taken on as a professor at Tennessee Wesleyan College. She taught politics and government, and she actually had her degree in public administration. But the Battle of Athens was a big influence on Mary Shadow. And so whenever she learned of it, and whenever she learned what had happened, and she also caught wind of what was happening in her hometown of Decatur, where one of the sheriff had essentially at the courthouse, he took the ballot box out of the courthouse, and he walked out there on the courthouse lawn, struck a match, and basically burned the ballot box on the courthouse lawn and said, "These have been tampered with, they're no good." So election integrity was a big issue at that time in Tennessee, and it was a big influence on Mary Shadow, and it was one of those events that sort of prompted her to run for public office. And so the title, Pretty Miss Shadow, started going around and round and round, because whenever she had decided that she was thinking about getting into the political sphere, that's all people knew her for. They thought she was kind of a joke because she was a woman, and so whenever she had started trying to run and think about running, people were like, well, that's all fine, that sounds great, but you can't do it. It was actually while she was studying in her graduate studies down at the University of Alabama that her professor had assigned her in her class a case study of sorts. Pick a political event, it can be from anywhere in the world really, and study it. What does it teach us? What is it about? And so Mary decided to do some research on the Battle of Athens and local government. I don't have that paper. I wish I did. I'm sure you all wish you did too, because I don't know, it just sounds pretty interesting since it's one of those things that influenced her. But her professor had said, study it, come back and tell us what you found out, and we'll go from there. And it's odd enough because she would ride a Greyhound bus back and forth from Tennessee to Alabama, and the guy that drove the bus was from Ray County. And so that was her district. Ray County and Meigs County were together in the state legislature. And she said, what do you know? What can you tell me about local government? And that's whenever he suggested to her, well, why don't you research this guy over here in Dayton named Walter White? And that was my connection to Mary's story, because Walter White is one of my great uncles. He's actually my great-great-great-grandmother's little brother. And so whenever I came across Mary's story in the event of all of this, it kind of spawned the presentation that you're getting today. And so Mary decided to go over to Ray County and to poke around at Walter White to see who that was, in which, if you've never heard of Walter White before, he was a character. That's all I've ever been told, was he was a character. He was in the Scopes trial in 1925, and he had been superintendent of schools for about a quarter of a century. And he's kind of the powerful political head of his day, because while he was also superintendent of schools, he was also state legislator. And so he kind of operated back and forth, and he had a pretty good grip on Ray County affairs, Ray County government, that kind of thing. Kind of similar to what you all see here in McMinn County, which led to the Battle of Athens, is when people start, getting their hands in multiple pockets, so to speak. And so whenever Mary was researching Walter White, and she went around to all these business leaders, they said, Professor White's a good enough guy, but man, the county's financial situation is rough. And it had been that way really since the 30s and 40s, since the Great Depression. And she said, that's pretty interesting that they all had this same gripe with him. And whenever she went to turn that paper back in and basically was reporting on White's theatrics as she was relating them to the Battle of Athens and to what happened here in McMinn County, she said, it's just a shame, that something can't be done about those people. And that's when her professor looked at her and said, well, talking alone is not going to fix that problem. Why don't you run for office and clear that mess up? She said, maybe I will. And that's kind of how it happened. And so whenever Mary ran for the first time, of course, she couldn't run in 46 whenever the Battle of Athens happened, because that was sort of what sparked her. So the first time that she ran would have been in 1948. And that's how we get to this moment. So you're probably looking at this screen and wondering, well, if Walter White, you sound like he said, was a pretty big Republican, how does he end up over there with the independent while this random guy named Earl Mack Smith ends up with a Republican nomination? Story for another time, but let me summarize it. So Walter White, he has sort of been on the fringes of Ray County politics for a while. You've heard of the GI ticket before, all those veterans that come back and they run for office. That kind of was a big deal here in 46. Well, Ray County had one of those too, but in 46, it didn't work. There was only one GI that was elected to the Ray County government in 1946, and that was Sheriff Kelly. And he was they called him a stooge of Walter White. He was a pretty close confidant of his. And so in 1948, whenever the Republican primary was held, Earl Max Smith debatably got the Republican nomination from Walter White. And he is a GI. And so they thought this was their, no pun intended, they thought this was their ticket in. And so Mary Shadow would end up having a three-way battle for the state representative's race as compared to just a two-way sort of like spearhead. And Mary Shadow is pretty interesting to know. In the Democratic primaries, she had no challenger. And so a lot of people were wondering, well, what was she doing during that time? Well, she was bettering herself. She had been studying and she had been a little bit involved in county government, not too much, but that was what people were complaining about. They said, you've got these ideas, but you have no experience. And Walter White was calling her out on that as well, because his whole slogan for 48 was, experience counts. And so Mary Shadow spent the majority of her time convincing her own party that she was worthy of running. And a little funny story on that end, the chairman of the Democratic Party in Ray County was a guy named Walter Cheers. And Mary had called over there one day, and she said, Mr. Cheers, I'm interested in running for state representative. And he said, you are? That was a prank call, just basically hung up on her. She called back again. She said, Mr. Cheers, I'm pretty interested in running for state representative. He said, look, that's not funny anymore. Call back a third time. Mr. Cheers, I'm interested in running for state representative. He started giving in a little bit. He said, okay, if you're going to run for state representative, answer me this. He said, if this happens, he's just throwing out hypothetical situations. He said, if A happens, what's B and C? And she just responded, well, Mr. Cheers, what would you do? He said, that's how I knew when that woman was a politician, because a true politician never lets anyone know what they're thinking. And he thought, maybe she's got a chance. And so whenever the 1948 race came to a climax in November, guess who won? Whenever you split your vote with the independent and the Republican, which was a big deal, Mary Shadow won her route to the state legislature. And that was a pretty big moment, and it started catching a lot of people's attention, including Dr. David Hill. He's going to come into the subject here in just a little bit. And so you're probably wondering if she got elected. Oh, there's some pictures of them, by the way. And this is really interesting. I gotta do a little segue here. Since I am related to Walter White, that picture on the left, even though it looks rough, I have the original of it. I don't have it here with me, but I've got the original. And I put in my paper, in my senior thesis, I said, this right here speaks volumes to the character of the two people at the time. Walter White, he's up here on a stage, he's literally on a pedestal speaking in Decatur at a political rally. The people are forced to come to him. That's not what she did. She went to the people. She was a very grassroots style politician. She was walking up and down the roads even with her signs, her campaign signs, and handing out her cards and all that stuff. And in fact, one funny story, Walter Cheers had come to Decatur one time. I forgot, he was on political business. And he drove by Mary Shadow as she was walking down the road. Well, she started trying to wave him down and stop him for a second, and he did, and she ran down the road and caught up to him, and he looked down at her feet whenever she had caught up to him and said, Miss Shadow, he's like, the Democratic Party of Tennessee might be poor, but we're not that poor. She wasn't wearing any shoes. And so a lot of people thought that was sort of the callback to the everyday politician. She was meeting the people where they were versus having the people come to them. But I will say, in Walter White's defense, he didn't have to go to the people. They already knew who he was. They didn't know who she was in 48. This was the guy, if you don't know as much about him, he ran for governor of Tennessee in 1924 and in 1926. He didn't get the Republican nomination in 24. He did in 26 and got shellacked by a guy named Austin Peay. But then after that, in between that time, in 1925, he was known for bringing the charges against a young substitute teacher over in Ray County named John T. Scopes. He actually sat beside William Jennings Bryan at the Scopes trial too. So everyone in the area knew who Walter White was. But Mary Shadow still came away with a victory. It was pretty impressive. So what does it look like, though? What does her time in the legislature look like? is pretty geared at Walter White, if we're being honest. So Mary Shadow, of course, like I've been saying, she was a Democrat. This guy right here, Kimmer, he was the state senator. He was also a Democrat. Guess what they have in common? They don't like Walter White. And so the whole gear of the first time in the legislature for Mary Shadow was, how can we get this guy out of office? He's been there. I mean, the first time he was elected, of course, it wasn't consistently, but the first time that he was elected was in 1909. That's like the era of Teddy Roosevelt. This is 1948. It's time, buddy. You ever look at career politicians and they've been in there for 50 years and you're like, okay, it's time. You might have done something good in the past, but it's time. And so Mary Shadow, she actually got a few dings on her political reputation, because what she was kind of ill at Walter White for doing, which was basically introducing all of this legislation into the legislature every single term. She did that herself in an effort to get him out. Now, I will say that wasn't her only focus while she was in there her first term, but it was a big one. And to her credit, too, I mean, he did have his hands in everything. So you can see that it was actually a pretty noble thing to do, but the way that she went about it left a few people going, well, you might want him out, but you're kind of stooping to his level and you're indulging in his tactics to do it. And so a lot of people kind of were a little bit miffed by that, but it went away after she got done pretty much what all she had set out to do. And she was also interested, remember me saying whenever she did a research paper, that the county finances were just a complete wreck. Well, not all of that fell back on the superintendent of schools, but a lot of it did, because that seemed to be where all the money was going, and the schools weren't even producing that much. And so Mary Shadow had an realignment of both county finances in Ray County and Meigs County, and a lot of people respected her for that as well. And I will say, too, in terms of being an instant celebrity, what happened, the way that I was told that Dr. Hill came across Mary Shadow, was he saw her picture in a magazine. I'm not positive that it's that one on the left, but it had to have been from about that time. We actually have that original magazine over at our museum in Decatur. And this picture right here on the right is from when she was a professor at Tennessee Wesleyan. But whenever she was in the state legislature, you see that dress that she's wearing, the little suit coat thing that she's wearing there? She made that. All of her clothes that she wore to every term in the legislature were handmade by her. And if you're wondering, well, if she's state legislature in Nashville and she's from over here in Meigs County, how does that transition? She would stay over there through the week, and she would come home on the weekends to check on her constituents. And so her first term in the legislature was a pretty bold one, because everything went right except for the very end. And at the very end of the first term in the legislature, she was going to introduce a bill to make it mandatory for school superintendents to take a test. And if she introduced that bill and it got passed, you could pretty much bet that Walter White's days were numbered. The bill failed. And whenever it did, she just kind of lost it. And she held her breath for a minute, and she sank down in her chair, and she started to cry. And people, of course, she was the only woman in the legislature. All these men started looking around at her and went, by God, she is a woman. Because she had tried so hard to put that behind her, or kind of keep that to herself while she was there. Because even though she was a trailblazer, she didn't want people to look at her differently or think that, she's different. She's one of them. She's there to do what they're doing for their constituents in their counties. She's there to do that for Ray and Meigs counties. She didn't focus on the fact that she was a woman, but she knew that was playing a role in what she was doing. And so, since she didn't get Walter White out of office, it came back again. And this time, there was no Earl Mack Smith in the race. It was just Mary Shadow and Walter White. And in 1948, that's what people were saying was, well, Smith in there, he sort of was the weird one. He split the vote. That's why White didn't beat Shadow. This is what everybody was wanting. They said, there's nobody else. It's just them two. Whoever wins, wins. And 1950 was a very difficult year to run against Walter White, because it was the 25th anniversary of the Scopes trial. That was all coming back around full circle. The thing that made him famous was coming back into the news again. And I'm sure that she probably wasn't intimidated by that, because the one nick that she had the previous time before was she didn't have any experience. She's got that now, and she handed it to him pretty well in the legislature. He took loss after loss, and the only thing they really had to his name at this point was his superintendent's office. And like I said, he had held that for over a quarter of a century. And so she knew that if she could get him out of that office, that was it. Because she's got him at state representative. If she can get him at school superintendent, he's done. And so in late October, actually we're coming up on the anniversary of it, on October the 25th, 1950, it wasn't really necessarily Mary Shadow that got him out of office. It was the county courts. Because Walter White had been playing his hand at the county courts for some time, and they finally just stood up and said, I've had enough. And so on October the 25th, 1950, it's kind of funny, they had a meeting. Walter White had no representation at it, to where they basically took a vote and they said, yeah, this guy's out. He's not going to be school superintendent anymore. That's a pretty big deal, because this is, like I said, this is where he's made his claim to fame. Everybody knows Professor White. And so they go to Sheriff Kelly, who was, like I said, the GI candidate from 46 that had won, and they said, Sheriff Kelly, you're going to have to give this, you're going to have to give this old geezer his walking papers. You know, he's done. And he said, I'm not doing that. It's like, you don't want him in that office. You go tell him to get out of that office. And so they start going around to all these different county officials, and eventually they make their way to the coroner. And they say, Mr. Coroner, will you please give Mr. White this warrant that's basically a cease and desist, and you're not going to be superintendent anymore, pack your bags and leave. Well, he does. And I have a picture of that moment, but it's not in this PowerPoint. But that was a pretty big deal, because all of a sudden, since Walter White was kicked out of his school superintendent's office, every little ounce of momentum that he had rested on this 1950 race, which was a week later, right? And so he knew that he had to get to work right away. And in fact, one thing that's really interesting to know is about right in between the time there, he had a 30-car motorcade escort him through downtown Decatur as people were basically hyping him up. And that was sort of like the thing for Mary Shadow. She's thinking, oh my gosh, you know, what's fixing to happen here? Because it seems like what we've been waiting for, the highly anticipated rematch, whatever's fixing to happen is going to happen. Well, if you remember me saying that she played basketball for Coach Courthouse whenever he's basketball coach when she went to high school, he's principal now. This happened in between when Walter White was kicked out of office and whenever the election was. Have any of you ever heard of what happened with the Meigs County homecoming queen? Is that something that's familiar to any of you at all? Okay, this actually made it in Life magazine because of just how petty it was. But essentially what had happened was there was a fight over who the homecoming queen was for the high school in Decatur, and it got political. And you can't make it up. It was so insanely ironic as to how it happened. And what basically it came down to was this young lady down here on the bottom left, Jacqueline Grubb. She was going to be the homecoming queen. And back in that day, being homecoming queen wasn't just a popularity contest. You won by how much money you raised for the school through a penny vote. And so the more pennies you got donated to your campaign, the higher chance you had of winning. She was sponsored by that guy there at the top, who is ironically one of her relatives, a little bit distant, D.B. Powell. I will say that both of these girls on the bottom, I'm very fortunate for my studies, they're still alive today. And I've talked to Jacqueline. I haven't had a chance to talk to Annette, but I basically said, what happened? You know, tell me, because it sounds so convoluted and so messy, what happened? And she said, well, I was supposed to win. And she wasn't fibbing either. I can tell you she wasn't, because she had raised the most money. Principal Courthouse didn't want her to win. And you're probably wondering, well, why does he care? He's the principal. It's because she was backed by a Democrat and a supporter of Mary Shadow. He's like, we're not going to let the Democrats' little candidate win. He's like, I'm going to go put $25 worth of pennies. Let that sink in. I'm putting $25 worth on Annette Hips. It's like they were betting almost. And Annette Hips, as you can see here on the right, she won. And Jacqueline Grubb said, she said, I look like a little kitchen maid in that picture. I said, where'd the dress come from? She said, probably at Goodwill. I don't know. But it was kind of a really insane moment. And basically what D.B. Powell had to say about it was, he said, well, they're trying to elect Walter White, and we're trying to elect Mary Shadow, and that's where the whole mess goes back to. So even the homecoming queen was political in Meigs County in 1950 over who was supposed to go to the state legislature. Now, I will say, and speaking of D.B. Powell, everybody has a story about this guy. I don't know if any of you are from Meigs County or if you had D.B. Powell as a teacher or heard of people that did, but he was eccentric, we'll put it that way. And he had a peg leg. he had shot his leg off in a riding accident. He's riding a horse and he's a younger man, and he shot his left foot off, and so he had a peg leg, and he was kind of known for being a little friendly with some of his students, especially the girls. And one time, one of them was giving a presentation, and he had her up at the front of the class, and whenever she got done, he walked over there beside her and put his arm around her and said, "Susie, what are you going to get me for Christmas?" And she slapped him and she said, "A box of damn termites if you don't get your arm off of me." He's going to eat his leg. I thought that was a pretty good one. And one more little story about D.B. Powell. He actually goes on to be superintendent of Meigs County Schools, which is kind of weird. I did not know that. Now, everyone over in Meigs County has a D.B. Powell story. And he actually, one little thing that's kind of funny too, he used to keep a jar of alcohol, like rubbing alcohol, not like liquor or anything. He used to keep a jar of alcohol on his desk. And from what I was told from the people that had him as a student, they said he had like a little monkey claw that he would keep inside that jar. And whenever he wasn't up there talking, he'd be sitting at his desk picking his teeth. I can only imagine what kind of a guy that was. So, let's tie them together. We talked a little bit earlier, like I said, about Dr. Hill and his contributions to CP1, which contributed thereafter to the Manhattan Project. Well, how do they meet each other? Guess where they actually met? They met right here in Athens in 1950, in March of 1950, actually. So, like I said, at the beginning of this year, right before all this race got started, they met. And they courted during the summer, and believe it or not, they actually went abroad. They went over to Europe, they went into the Netherlands, and I think to Denmark too. Dr. Hill was on personal invitation of another renowned scientist, Niels Bohr, to speak at a seminar or something over there. But anyway, they came back and they became engaged in November, about a week after the Homecoming Queen incident. And then Mary Shadow, spoiler alert, she won her re-election in November, the week following the Homecoming Queen incident, and they became engaged. Well, in December, as a way to welcome in the new year, they hadn't really planned on it, but they just sort of threw it together last minute. The Shadows, or Mary Shadow, decided that she would marry Dr. David L. Hill. And they got married over in Jolton, Tennessee on New Year's Eve in 1950. I do have a little bit of details, I don't have them with me, unfortunately, of the wedding. Her twin sisters, Letha, who I've talked to personally, and Sophie. You probably heard of Sophie Shadow. She married Trent, yeah, there you go, Henry Trent. And so that's another name that a lot of people in the area are familiar with. There's, of course, Willis and Mary, the mother and the father. And her sisters, her twin sisters, were the maids of honor. This picture here on the far right, I'm almost convinced that it's a photo op and it's not really for anything in particular, because she ran so many headlines that she was going to retain her maiden name in the legislature. I'm kind of shocked to see that she's got a Mrs. David L. Hill nameplate in her hand. I would like to know if she actually used it or if she just did it for that picture. But that was taken, believe it or not, their honeymoon lasted about a day. I think it was, maybe an evening, not even a day, because the legislature convened the following week, and Vanderbilt, where Professor Hill had been assigned to teach physics, they were getting ready to welcome new students. And so they said, well, we can't let our love get in the way of our work. And so their honeymoon lasted about one evening before they got back to doing what it was that they truly were passionate about, which was physics and politics. So now you're probably wondering, if she got elected a second time, what did that look like? And honestly, we could spend an hour and a half, 2 hours, probably even more, on what she did while she was in there. But this one article I wanted to sort of focus on as a means to what she was really known for, and that was providing a voice of reason. So World War II, this is, like I said, it's 1951 now. World War II sort of, it was in the background now, and we were coming into the Cold War. And a big thing with that was communism. And so she was talking about, one thing that I really liked that she said was, we know that communism is a failure and that it doesn't work. And she was, of course, even calling out the Russian police state for all their atrocities that they committed. But she said, if we're going to tell the next generation that communism doesn't work, we can't just tell them, we have to show them. And I thought that was a pretty profound way to word things. And that's really what she became known for, was even though she was a little more progressive in her politics, she still held tight to principles and American values that I think a lot of us could look back on and admire for today. And so I found that very interesting. And actually, this resolution right here, where she's sort of reaffirming the words of Jefferson and bringing up American principles,
she introduced in the state legislature at the same time she introduced a memorial for Walter White, because a lot of people think that losing both of his offices killed him, because whereas he lost his election in November of 1950 and he was kicked out of office in October of 1950 from superintendent's chair, he died in February of 1951. And so Mary Shadow, she did a very honorable gesture in that regard by asking that the State House representatives remember Professor White for his many years of service to Tennessee, and she actually made it possible for the flag atop the state capitol to fly at half-staff that day. So we were very grateful for that. But to keep with that idea of communism sort of being one of those things that were on the edge of everybody's seat at the time, after Dr. Hill had served a couple of years at Vanderbilt as a professor, and after Mary Shadow had served her second term in the state legislature, she said, you know what, I don't think I want to do this anymore. The guy that she went in there to get out, I don't know if she realized it or not, she got him out. She got him out of a lot, including life. And so whenever she got done with the second term in the legislature, she said, I think it's time. And so after she announced that she wasn't going to run anymore, Dr. Hill, who had been, I think it might have been in 52, I want to say. I'd have to go back and look. But he was appointed as national chairman of the American Federation of Scientists. Or maybe it's the Federation of American Scientists. Don't quote me on that. But after he served as the national chairman, he went on to become just the chairman of the Los Alamos chapter, which is how they found their way out to where Oppenheimer was. And it's kind of interesting we talk about the movie. And have you watched the movie Oppenheimer? Have some of you watched it? Yeah, so I thought the movie was pretty well made. I think a lot of us did. But one thing that I was kind of nipped at, especially when I look back at Dr. Hill now after having researched him, was I was kind of not irritated by the way that they portrayed him, but they just made him seem kind of like, he was in maybe 5 minutes of the movie, but they made him seem sort of like a bumbling idiot for 2 of the 3 times, you know. He dropping his clipboard, and Oppenheimer took a pen and shoved it back in his lab pocket like he didn't really know what he was doing. But I don't think that their relationship was like that, and I'll tell you why. Because I've actually talked to people that knew Dr. Hill and knew his relationship with Oppenheimer, and I think that the two had a lot of mutual respect for one another based on what I can gather. It was said that Dr. Hill, whenever he needed to clear his mind from the work that they were doing at Los Alamos, he would take trips around the countryside and just sort of go for a long walk. And occasionally when he went on those walks, he was accompanied by Mr. Oppenheimer. And sometimes, even whenever they got over there, they had some kids by that point. David and Mary had a son named David. He would carry little David around on his shoulders and sort of hoist him up and walk around the countryside with him. So I thought that was very neat. But you don't really see that relationship in the movie. You just kind of see he's there at the end and he's doing something really important. It's like, how did he get to that point? Well, I think that's where this comes in handy. Because for those of you that haven't saw Oppenheimer, it covers a pretty significant amount of time. It goes from whenever he was in college to whenever he was working on the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. And then it goes into his security clearance dilemma, which we're going to get to because I think that it plays a significant role in how David Hill got to that testimony against Louis Strauss. And so this just sort of segues us into how they get from Tennessee to New Mexico. Now, I will say that the rest of what I'm going to be presenting on, which isn't too much longer, is going to be more focused on Dr. Hill than it is on Mary Shadow. Whenever she got out there, her big deal was kind of already done. She'd set out what she had wanted to accomplish in Tennessee. And so she would run for the State House of Representatives in New Mexico. She would secure the Democratic nomination for that, but she lost the general election to a Republican named Thomas Roberts. In 1956, Mary Shadow would go to the Democratic National Convention in favor of Stevenson and Kefauver, and that was someone that she's always really close with, actually. And I don't know if it was because they agreed on a whole lot or if it's just because they were both from this area, was Estes Kefauver. She had a lot of admiration for him, and in fact, whenever you saw that picture of her reading that book a few slides ago, that was an Estes Kefauver book that he had wrote. So there was a little bit of politics on her end. She stayed political till the day she died, really, but not to the level that she had been when she was in the Tennessee State House. So the lead up to the testimony, because the testimony is kind of what Hill is known for. Well, before you get to the testimony of Hill against Strauss, you have to talk about Oppenheimer's security problem. And his security clearance, people were wondering, was is he going to get it or is he not? Because ironically, he did have past affiliations, or they believe that he had past affiliations to the Communist Party. And so Louis Strauss had sort of instigated this whole thing, and it goes back to a hearing in the Senate, I believe it was, in 1949, where Strauss said he did not want radioisotopes shipped to Norway, and Oppenheimer did, and Oppenheimer sort of won the argument, and so Strauss kind of got miffed at him, and that was sort of where the seeds of disunion were sown in that regard. And so to get back at him here a couple of years later, Strauss said, you want your security clearance? You're going to have to go through this panel of people, and they don't think that you're very good. And so David Hill sort of stood up for Oppenheimer at that time. Of course, I wish this would have been in the movie. He sort of stood up for Oppenheimer, and I thought that little sentence right over there at the bottom of the first article was very interesting. Seldom on this side of the Iron Curtain has a citizen who has served his country as well as Robert Oppenheimer been more miserably rewarded by his government. Like I said, Hill had a lot of respect for Dr. Oppenheimer. And so that was kind of what started the whole debacle of how does Hill get to the testimony against Strauss in 1959, and it's ultimately where Hill makes his claim to fame. Now, for me, one of the questions that I had in talking about this very famous testimony was, like I said, how did he get there? Because it just seemed like in the movie, he just comes out of nowhere at the very end, and he's there for like 2 minutes, and he's done. But what he had to say was very important, because President Eisenhower was trying to get Louis Strauss to be confirmed as the Secretary of Commerce. Well, he had to go through a hearing, right? He had to be confirmed, and so that's how Hill ended up where he was. But a lot of people had asked me, they said, well, what qualifies him to speak against Strauss? And to me, like I said, the movie doesn't really show this at all. Hill was not a nobody, I don't think, because he was there since 42. After he graduated from California Institute of Technology in 1942, he started immediately working on Chicago Pile 1 that summer, and then he sort of contributed all this work to the Manhattan Project. He did go on, like I said, to be a professor at Vanderbilt. He was national chairman and then Los Alamos chapter chairman of the Federation of American Scientists. He had the credentials. And in fact, even before this, speaking of Kefauver a few minutes ago, he had sort of been like a personal aide to Kefauver in a sense where he would recommend him stuff. He would give him advice on different matters. You can look in other Senate committee hearings, and David Hill is there, or Kefauver is referencing David Hill. So it's very interesting to note that he had multiple connections. He just wasn't this guy floating around in left field waiting for it to fall out of the sky for him. But Dr. Hill, his most famous part of his testimony comes right here. Whenever he was talking, he said, really, if you read all that, he says, I really don't, I don't take pleasure in doing what I'm doing, but I have to speak up as I am a citizen and I am convicted on principles. And he said, I have to say may help indicate to you why most of the scientists in this country would prefer to see Mr. Strauss completely out of the government. That was a pretty big ordeal. And the words that he was saying and the charges that he was bringing against him of his arrogance and his vindictiveness, and he just sort of had it out for Oppenheimer, Hill basically blew the door wide open. And essentially that was what kept Louis Strauss from being confirmed as Secretary of Commerce. It's a very big moment in American history, very politicized as well. And it was very interesting to see that portrayed in the movie, because whenever I had called the family and asked them, I was like, well, how accurate was that? They said, from what we understand, pretty. And so that was very good to know at least the most important part of the testimony was as it probably would have been. So as for legacy and where we are today, like I said, I am a fourth great nephew of Walter White, and so my family's got quite a bit of history in Ray County. Well, this is the last surviving shadow. This is Mary's youngest sister. This is Sophie's twin, Letha, and we had her come up to our museum in Decatur last year for Veterans Day, and I got to meet her, I got to talk about her. You can't really see it right here, but we're looking at a picture of David and Mary in this binder, and it was really interesting to get to talk to her and hear her perspective. And I've also got to talk to a few other people that knew Dr. Hill, but there weren't quite as many that knew him as well as she did, because that was her brother-in-law. I will say that whenever I was writing my senior thesis at Bryan, a lot of my friends were interested in it because it was pretty compelling history. And they said, have you heard anything new about David Hill? Because that was a character they found pretty admirable. And I said, well, one of my friends, I forgot where he was from, he told me, he said, from what I remember about Dr. Hill, he said, he was a pretty good guy. He said, but he just always seemed to act like he was better than you. And one of my friends sort of laughed and went, he probably was. And I thought that was pretty funny. And then when the movie came out this year, it kind of left us with no doubt that David Hill's place in history has been cemented for future generations. And I can't wait to really see if anyone else does a deep dive into him. Like I said, I haven't been able to research him as much as I would like. Whenever I was asked to do this presentation today, I told Tyler, I said, I will try. I knew more about Mary than I did about David, but it's been very fun to research them both. And I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that there are so many people out there that care about their story and care about their connection to not only Athens, because I mean they met here, but to broader American history and to see where their paths led them. Now, if you're wanting to know, like, well, what happened after the Strauss hearing? Well, it didn't come without its repercussions. David Hill I'm not going to say he had that held against him, but politics is politics, and there's two sides to every story. A lot of people looked up on him and thought that was a very good thing what he did. He stood up for his beliefs. He stood up for the guy that he cared about. You know, he backed Oppenheimer till the end. Other people that were not in support of Oppenheimer, were not in support of Hill, they thought that he had really screwed the pooch for everything that he had done, and so a lot of people would hold it against him for the rest of his life, but that was sort of the most impactful moment that he had on American history. And just to think that he had passed through here, that his wife was raised here, and that he had this sort of connection to the local area was very interesting. So after all that was said and done, he would go on to head a few more companies before he would retire. Mary Shadow, actually, she died first. She died in 1992 in Germany. She loved to travel, so it's not really surprised she wasn't around when she passed away. And then Dr. Hill actually passed away in 2008. And so that was the end of that chapter of their lives. They had 7 children together. All of them, to my knowledge, are still alive. I think I've heard that a couple of them aren't in such good health nowadays, which is unfortunate. But I've really enjoyed getting to know that family. I've enjoyed getting to read the history. I'm excited to read more. And yeah, if you all have any questions, I think that'll about do it.
You said that they met. Did you say they met in McMinn County? Mm-hmm. What was he doing in McMinn County?
So I like that question. He actually went out of his way to come to McMinn County because of this magazine right here. What was said to me, what I was told was, well, Dr. Hill had got that magazine and he saw Mary Shadow on the front of it, and the words he used was, I was intrigued by her. And so he was on his way to Oak Ridge whenever he made a little pit stop in Athens to get to know this Tennessee Wesleyan professor turning politician. Anyone else? Thank you guys, it's been fun.